The plan had been to get to the meeting place, after I had acquired the access code, as quickly as possible. But after my encounter with the drone, I didn't want to take any chances, so I laid low for a couple of hours. If Special Branch had found me in cyberspace, you could be pretty sure they were close to finding you incarnate. The meeting place was one of many luxurious flats owned by a man who went under the pseudonym of Wagner. No one knew his real name. Wagner was supposed to be a hang-up from his MI6 days, but I wasn't even certain about that. He'd been good to work for up until now, so I didn't ask. I activated the comms device outside his front door, but there was no answer. He was probably out getting tea. Earl Grey most likely, but depending on the situation he may have gone for his herbal varieties. So instead I entered my code for the door's locking mechanism. Wagner was always late. I searched the flat. No one was around, so I watched some TV. It was an old person's pastime, but I had nothing better to do. About an hour later, Wagner arrived.
So you finally made it at last?
Wagner said, holding a cup of tea in his usual imperious tone.
I was wondering if you were going to show up at all.
The access code was trickier than I was led to believe. It took me longer than I expected.
Where is Jake?
At this precise moment in time, I don't know.
Well, if he doesn't show, I, and by extension you, are going to be in a world of trouble.
Well, you shouldn't have used Method 6 to control him, should you?
Listen, Ellie, I have a very important buyer lined up for this thing, and I can't just tell him the driver had a hangover. Ah, perhaps this is Jake. It better be, for your sake.
Thankfully it was. I acted tough in front of Wagner, but to be honest, I didn't know what he was capable of. Jake stumbled in through the door and was soon sober enough to go over the plan. Wagner wanted us to be able to recite it word perfect, fearing we could only mess it up if we couldn't. Somewhere in the middle of the exercise, Jake broke out in a sweat, begging for some Method 6. Wagner didn't give it to him until he could recite the whole plan without hesitation. After a few hours, we were ready to move out. Ultimately, it was very simple. Get the squirrel and get out.
The job is easy. Infiltrate and extract. Our client is an out-of-town collector of rare animals, a gene sampler, high-end cloner, and a custom organism designer. And it just so happens that some North London crime lord has a little collection of his own that contains something our client wants.
The squirrel?
Specifically, a red squirrel, believed to be extinct. There are believed to be only 7 or 8 left in private collections. The one we're after just happens to be up the street from us, in Mayfair, Unit 125.
That's off the moto grid.
Your moto's still got wheels, hasn't it?
Yeah, why?
Because you're going to have to drop off the grid.
Wagner handed Jake a piece of paper.
Paper, how quaint.
The squirrel is in cage 143. It shouldn't be too hard to find. Don't bugger this one up, Jake.
Jake's moto was a 2098 Skoda, or at least it used to be. Not only was the Motogrid adaptation dubiously attached, but most of the mechanical mods were illegally fitted. Jake deactivated his security systems, and the doors automatically opened. We got in. The doors closed around us. Jake started the ignition and punched some overhead buttons. The car jerked off the ground as we ascended to the Motogrid. I always had a bad feeling when Jake was behind the wheel. You could never be sure what he was going to do. I looked over at Jake worryingly. He had a Method 6 patch in his hand. My God, you're not going to do this high? Jake looked at me with a smug grin.
My moto, my rules. There's no way I'm falling off the grid for a job for Wagner, sober.
Jake! The force of the initial acceleration squashed me into my seat. I turned my head to look out of the window. The streets below whizzed by, along with the genetically altered crops on the rooftop plantations. They were heavily protected by razor wire fences, tripwires, and other dangerous traps that awaited any would-be thief. Ever since the tsunami, these plantations had become a precious commodity. Jake stopped accelerating at about 300 kilometers per hour.
Hold on, we're going to drop in hard.
I looked forward. The Motogrid disappeared about 300 meters in front of us. Jake, slow down! We flew off the Motogrid. The violent descent threw me against the ceiling. We smashed to the ground. The car swerved violently until it finally came to a halt, millimetres away from the wall, perfectly parallel. I didn't have room to open my door. It was times like this that I was glad I carried a bolter pistol. I snapped, pulled out my sidearm from my leg utility pouch, and pointed it at Jake's face. "Okay, Jake, this is how it's going to be." He reeled in shock as he realised he was staring down the barrel of a pistol.
What the hell, Ellie? What's your problem?
You're the one with the problem, Jake. If you don't sober up right now and start acting like we're actually on a job, I'm going to paint the interior of your car with the contents of your head, then dump your body for the organ harvesters. I composed myself, then pointed down the alleyway. "See that red door? That's where you need to go. By the time you get there, I'll have the door unlocked and you can sneak inside."
Okay, I'm going. You better have the security deactivated, otherwise this will be a very short job.
Just get on with it, Jake. As Jake rushed through the door, I activated my internal Wi-Fi connection and accessed the security protocols for the building. I entered in the digital key that I had stolen earlier that night and deactivated the security protocols. With excellent timing for once, Jake had reached the door. The security cameras had been switched off, but as I attempted the cage locks, my alarm tripped. Suddenly, there was Wi-Fi chatter everywhere. It was rich tech, super encrypted. I didn't have time to hack it. I didn't need to. It was a swarm. I hastily hit my conscious reboot and got out of there. I took a gasp of air and looked around frantically. I could hear the buzz of the patrol vehicles echoing off the buildings, but I couldn't see them. There was no time. I jumped into the driver's seat and drove to the red security door. I frantically honked the horn. Moments later, Jake rushed out of the door, cage in hand. "Jake, get in!"
What are you doing?
"Shut up, Jake. They're on to us." As I said those words, we were surrounded by patrol vehicles. "We can't get through, Jake. What are we going to do?" Jake calmly pressed a few buttons on the dashboard. "What are you doing?"
Wait until one of them gets alongside us and floor it when I give the word.
I was sceptical, to say the least. A man wearing a police uniform approached from the rear. He walked to the driver's side door and produced a handgun. He aimed at the back of my head.
Get out of the car. Hands in the air. Floor it!
I hit the accelerator. Jake had engaged the moto's microjets. We smashed into the vehicle in front and it was thrown out of the way. The acceleration was twice as violent as before. We began to leave the patrol vehicles behind. The officer fired a few desperate shots, but they just ricocheted off the bodywork. "Quick, check the cage." Jake untied the canvas sack surrounding the cage and peered inside.
This is one funny-looking squirrel.
I froze. I looked into the cage. That's not a squirrel. It's a rat. Then it hit me. Wagner. We've been had. Wagner has some explaining to do.
In that episode of Dayender, Ellie was played by Amy Batty, Jake was played by Sam Rich, and Wagner was played by Mark Siddle. Dayender has been adapted from the original NYC 2123 graphic novel by Chad Allen. Dayender was written, produced, and directed by TJ Cheeseman, Rob Norris, and Oliver Paglia. Dayender has been adapted under a Creative Commons non-commercial share-alike license.